I'd love to go back to Jerry Baldwin and Gordon Bowker and Zev Siegel. Those guys were an iconic team that everything they touched was turned to gold. Talk a little bit about those three, if you would, Bob, and why the successes that they had with things like Red Hook and Starbucks, and what was it about those three entrepreneurs that caused such amazing success?
So the way they came together is interesting and serendipitous, the way startups often are. They lived in three little houses on West Bertona Street, which is below Perkins Lane in Magnolia. And there was one hot water heater for the three houses. So the guys had to talk to each other about when someone was going to wash dishes or take a shower. And so they became friends. And when they got their first jobs, they decided they would splurge and buy coffee like the good Pete's coffee Gordon and Jerry had tasted when they were in the Bay Area in college, University of San Francisco. So one of them every frequent period would drive up to Vancouver, British Columbia to buy coffee. And as Gordon describes it, on one of his trips back through the border, as he was passing Lake Sammamish, he said, "I was blinded by the reflection off the lake. And like Saul at Tarsus, I had an epiphany and said, why don't we start our own?" So they went to Alfred Pete to buy coffee. Alfred agreed to sell them coffee up until the time they got to 6 stores, at which time he wanted them to build their own roasting plant up here. And when they opened the 6th store, which was University Village, is when they opened the store on East Marginal Way here in Seattle. Well, Gordon went on to start Red Hook, was involved in the Seattle Weekly, Sasquatch Publishing, Heckler Bauker Advertising. As you've identified, everything they touched wasn't just a hit, it was a home run. And Zev left. Zev may be the most socially gifted person I've ever met who can go into any situation and make friends. And Zev left and started a dozen other businesses on his own. Gordon became the chair and senior manager of Pete's Coffee and shepherded it through his growth. And Gordon continues to cogitate things. Gordon says that his goal in life is to be bored. So every afternoon he tries to take a walk because when he's bored is when he comes up with his ideas. And I've been lobbying him for 20 years to write the story about Gordon Bowker and the growth of Seattle, and I've been unsuccessful in yet another endeavor.
Wow. What a great story. And it just reminds me, Bob, that Seattle really is the hub for so many entrepreneurs and so many companies that really have broken the way, led the way. Nordstrom from a little boot company supplying people going up to the gold rush in Alaska. And you've got, Amazon, Microsoft, Boeing, all these companies that are such innovative companies. Do you have a theory as to why Seattle is such a hub for innovation?
Well, interestingly, when we lived in the Bay Area, I spent a lot of time looking at California history. And if you've spent any time in the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, you know that those are different people. They're really different, and they think about life differently and they behave differently. And my conclusion is, if you lived in the United States in the mid-1800s and weren't succeeding in Ohio or New Jersey or Philadelphia, and you heard about the gold rush in California, you abandoned everything and you fled to California to cash in on it. So the risk profile of the people, the white people who initially settled California, was very, very high. They were tolerant of that. And if you look at the risk profile of Silicon Valley and the venture community and the law firms, that profile is still there. A similar thing happened in Seattle, and I believe the reason it happened here is this is where the railroads ended. If you couldn't make it in the Midwest or East Coast and you got on a train, you couldn't go any farther than Olympia or Seattle. And they got off the train and they started here. And again, they had a very high risk profile. So they were willing to do stuff and try stuff that people weren't willing to do or try in other places.
You've helped in the planning and development of a number of significant public projects in Seattle, at the airport, at Coleman Dock, the viaduct replacement. At what point in your career, Bob, did you decide that you were going to make civic leadership part of who you were?
So the management school I attended trained managers for the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And every class I took, whether it was accounting or marketing, talked about how to manage in each of those three sectors. The model for the school was Bill Donaldson, who grew up in Buffalo, New York, went to Manhattan, founded Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, the first of the successful boutique investment banks. But then he also worked for Henry Kissinger in the State Department, became the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So he danced back and forth between the public and private sector. And of course, as a consequence, he was involved in lots of nonprofit stuff. So after Lisa and I got finances stabilized and knew that we didn't have to worry about jobs or income the way we did when we were a young couple starting out, I saw that there were lots of problems or opportunities that I had ideas about that I could help with, but it's very easy to criticize stuff and then not do anything about it. And I don't think you have the right to be a complainer unless you're willing to roll up your sleeves and try and help on things. So that's how it initially came. My biggest involvement was, of course, the tunnel, the viaduct, and the new waterfront park. And that initially developed purely out of a self-interest. When the environmental impact statement on replacing the viaduct was written, I was probably one of a handful of non-paid people who read the 600-page environmental impact statement. And one of the things that identified was the two preferred alternatives to replace the viaduct would have Alaskan Way Surface Street closed for 116 or 117 months.
Whoa.
Mark, do the math. That's 10 years.
Oh my goodness.
So I called Chuck Kirshner, the city mitigation manager, and said, hey, Chuck, there's 2,500 family wage jobs down here on these piers. What do we do for 10 years? And he looked at me and said, do you want to stay open? And that's when I knew if we didn't get involved, a major element of the city was going to be eviscerated. So I began to look at the details of how the viaduct was going to be replaced. The State Department of Transportation, after the Nisqually earthquake, looked at more than 70 alternatives to replace the viaduct. And I made a spreadsheet that went through each of those 73 alternatives and identified how long will it take, how long is the disruption, where does the traffic that was on the viaduct go during replacement, what's the environmental impact, what does this mean for retail? And I came across this alternative called the Deep Bore Tunnel. Do you know where the machines that dug the English Channel were built?
Japan?
Kent.
Kent?
Robbins Tunnel Boring
Really?
equipment built the machines that dug the English Channel Tunnel.
Oh my gosh.
At the start of the tunnel process here, the Bertha Tunnel, there were more than 800 tunnels in and around Puget Sound. Seattle is one of the world headquarters for tunneling knowledge. And so I called Dick Robbins, whose father started Robbins Tunnel Boring. We had lunch at the pier, and I asked him, when you met with WashDOT to talk about would a deep bore tunnel work here, Dick said WashDOT never called. I asked him who the world's foremost expert on deep bore tunnels was. He said, you're not going to like this answer either. The head of the World Tunneling Consortium is a guy named Harvey Parker. He lives in Bellevue.